So Bear, if you, we did a question, sorry, we're going to take them at the end. Bear, do you want to jump in?
Yes, yeah, I'll be sharing my screen. Okay, can you see this?
Yeah.
Great. So thank you for having me today. These are two very difficult talks to follow in the sense that I really hope I can bring a contribution to this discussion. I thought over the next few minutes I will maybe bring a small example of how I've been incorporating or sort of bringing in Southern values or readings and positions in my teaching practice at the London University and the impact that this has had on myself and on my students. And I hope that this will sort of continue a reflection that perhaps also Ola was bringing in on the potential of embedding Southern perspectives in learning, teaching, and writing about cities in the context of a European higher education institution, which is my own experiential context. And maybe to start talking about the context, I think it's also important to, so sometimes we tend to homogenize what UK academia in particular might mean, but in sort of in the context that I've been experiencing is one where UK higher education is marked by considerable structural inequalities. And London Metropolitan University, where I work, is what is a so-called post-92 university that was formerly a polytechnic, so a technical school. And historically in the UK, post-92 universities have been viewed as quite peripheral to the circuits of knowledge production and having a stronger focus on maybe vocational education and also applied research compared to Russell Group universities. And despite, or maybe because of this, actually, the post-92 universities have also played a really important and vital role in promoting access to higher education in the UK, particularly for students from working class backgrounds or global majority backgrounds. So the slide that you're seeing here shows the composition of our student population at London Met. And I wanted to highlight this because this includes some quite important structural differences from other institutions. It includes many individuals who are returning to education while employed, and this is reflected in this sort of 82% of students being mature, which means that they're coming in education after having worked for some time, and a lot of them are still employed and sort of managing education while working. And there's also a percentage of students from a global majority background, which is 55%, is twice that of the national average. Overall, the University London Met as a context has a strong commitment to social equity, and this has been becoming more and more central in the last few years and has been evidenced but also supported by the recent release of a race equity strategic plan that drives a lot of the institution's work. And education is really a key component of this plan. And one of the key elements of this has been an education for social justice framework, which we now all work towards and through within the institution, which is at the core to this mission of equity in education. And the framework was developed jointly by staff and students through the support of the Students' Union as a sort of way of creating a values-led approach to curricular reform. And this will be a longer term process, but which is having a lot of repercussions across all the departments and all the areas of the school. And within this sort of, I'm not sure you can see the details, but within this definition of equity in education, so today the university is bringing the idea of education as a form of liberation for students, education as a way of building solidarity. They're addressing very explicitly issues around race and coloniality in UK academia. So it's an interesting context to be thinking from. So I joined this university in 2020, and when all these frameworks were being mainstream now released by the institution. And then in 2021, I began leading a postgraduate seminar module called Changing Places, which is part of our professionally accredited program in architecture. And the module functions in many ways as a reading group itself. It's a reading and writing group where students are discussing texts, they are developing their own writing skills, and then as an outcome, they are submitting an essay at the end of the semester. And the idea of changing places that is to somehow challenge the traditional view of places as static entities that are depicted in architectural drawings. And the module has been pre-existed, like me joining the university, and has been encouraging students to recognize the changing nature of places and how they evolve over time. And so this quite small and simple move of putting emphasis on change and time. The aim has been to encourage students or inspire students maybe to consider people's right to build and adapt their homes, their neighborhoods, their cities, and sort of in autonomy and over time. And so this approach has also been a way to discuss with students the traditions of professional dominance in the built environment, the traditions or sort of definitions of the profession and who has a say in how cities are built. And at the same time, we've been using this as a space to also discuss professional dominance in the classroom and sort of in the design studio and who defines values in architecture. And since I have designed the module joining in 2021, I've been drawing extensively with students from sort of feminist, Southern, and the colonial writings on cities, with the aim of sort of supporting with other and with colleagues, but supporting an expansion of the archive of places or archive of experiences that we learn from within the school of and the course of architecture. And at the same time, as we read all this material and we discuss this material, students are invited to write about the changing place of their own choice. And the main criterion here is that the place must be close to them biographically. So I asked them to write from a position of entanglement so that they can frame also their own knowledge as relevant, as accurate and reliable, and so to put that knowledge at the center of their academic writing as well. So the module, you're seeing here slides that I prepared for students at the beginning of the year, but the module is organized around sort of these 4 key themes, where we start from the idea of practice and otherwise, and then talk about materialities and material cultures, social relationships, and then aspirations, speculations, and sort of urban imaginaries. So we begin by reflecting on students' own practice and what they understand as their practice, and then gradually expand this discussion to think about sort of how places are made materially, what are the social relations that sustain them, and finally the imaginaries that guide how cities are built and are regulated. And within each of these themes, I sort of include 2 sessions normally. So in the first one, we include a talk where either I or a guest introduces some of the key issues, questions, literature, and this is followed by a hands-on workshop where we learn from a particular place. And then in the second session, we have a student-led discussion around text and films, as well as a writing workshop. And we've been reading quite broadly, especially I would say in the context of an architecture school. A lot of the sources that we are exploring are quite new to my students. So for instance, in the section on practice and otherwise, we start from your paper on Southern practice, Gautam, and pair it with Jay Aranda's work on critical spatial practice, writings on decolonizing design. In materialities, we've read in different years, different material, but looking at Leandro Minuchin, Caldera on peripheralization. We watch documentaries such as the one listed here on sort of the story of a Black-led self-building community in London. And then we move on to, say, social relationships. We've explored again various texts from Abdulmalik Simon to Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality and works related to queer in design. And then finally, we land in this sort of discussions around aspirations and futures, where we have engaged with Apadurai's classic work on the capacity to aspire, Achille Mbembe's work on the Afropolis. And last year we watched together, we watched and discussed the film Black Panther, which was also in an interesting way of sparking a discussion on what do we mean by future and sort of futuring in cities. Then there are these place-based workshops that we run that begin with students describing their own experiences of sort of places and community-based architecture and urbanism. And then I've been taking them to a journey through a few places, like we've been discussing experiences from Freetown, São Paulo, and Cape Town last year. And in these workshops, I'm using resources that were created by colleagues with whom I have collaborated in each of these cities. And the main objective is really to encourage students to reflect on their own changing places from a different perspectives, and then sort of bringing in comparisons, thinking about how places might look and feel elsewhere. And then with the writing workshops, the aim is really to help students practice hands-on in the classroom some of the writing practice that they will need to develop for their essay. So they start by writing about their position in relation to a place. Then we start experimenting with how they might bring in other people's voices, their theory. We have a long session where we reflect on politics of citations and sort of how do we select which voices we are drawing from. And we use then images to approach writing more as a storytelling. And through these workshops, they're really encouraged to, again, it's learning from a lot of the literature that you've also been discussing and experiences and practicing in the group. But they're encouraged to write from their chosen places, right, rather than simply writing about these places. So this involves a lot of what we've been calling in the module writing biographically, and it is about inscribing in their texts their own personal entanglements with particular locations, with people, situations, or maybe stories. And the module has been a learning curve for me as well, and to structure some of these workshops, especially the sort of how we might approach writing in a way that makes it less daunting and less scary sometimes for students who are used to designing as their primary mode of expression. I have drawn from these two texts in particular, and both include a lot of also practical resources on how to challenge knowledge hierarchies in the way we write and address issues of dominance in the classroom, as well as, again, in writing practice. And students have reacted in very different ways to different elements of this course. Some find it easier to navigate than others. And I think that in the future, one thing I could do more and I would like to do more is to ensure that our debates are more closely linked to their own lived experience. But I thought to close to make a few examples of the type of writing that or the topics that they have been working on, which I think sort of opens up some interesting reflections on the possibilities that it has created for them. So quite a few essays over the last couple of years have been focusing on unearthing stories of places that might not necessarily, sort of the main stories normally told about those. So Rachel, for instance, delved into English folktales in Stroud, Gloucester, and discovered how these stories from Stroud, sort of traditional stories, would offer insights into ways of making kin in post-anthropocentric words. Laura's essay on community land ownership in the Scottish Highlands and Islands began by examining the history of what are called as known as the Highland clearances in Scotland. And she looked at this as an experience of dispossession, and then focused on crofting, which is a unique form of land tenure in Scotland, as a way of imagining potential future based on collective land stewardship. Other works have sort of been trying to look at places through some of the theories that we had discussed and some of the writings we had shared. For instance, Oliver revisited his experience of visiting and working in a bus-vacant airfield in Berlin, in Germany. And his essay was exploring sort of grassroots repair initiatives through the theoretical frameworks of Simon's Peoples as Infrastructure. And he was drawing a lot from Caldera's work in his own reflections. Sarah, which is another example I'm bringing here, wrote a reflective sort of essay looking at her own design unit's work in Athens, Greece, where they were working sort of refugee settlements within the city. And she started exploring in the essay the concept of spatial intersectionality as a way of reflecting on her own position within the design studio, but also to gain a deeper understanding of the place she was working on, to a more embodied perspective. And then Jeffrey was part of a set of essays that were maybe trying to work more on the idea of unlearning certain ways of seeing. He was investigating the mansions building in Hong Kong, and this prompted him to reflect on his own perspective as a Hong Kong native of Chinese ethnicity, and he was using film to examine how sort of biased and stereotypical portrayals of places are perpetuated in popular culture. So all over the past 2 years, I think students have been using these essays to think about their positionality a lot in relation to places. And these exercises have enabled some of them to explore different perspectives, to create more site-specific bibliographies or resource lists and questions as well. And through this process, my hope is that they've had the chance as well to value their lived experiences as the source of knowledge, as a primary source of knowledge they were drawing from, and so at the same time recognizing how this is connected to other people's histories and perspectives. And finally, in addition to, I would say, to individual students' growth, the module has also been aiming to broaden our understanding of architecture, both in the school and sort of in a bigger professional field. So seeing these essays in relation to each other, my and my colleagues' hope has been that the module can offer more diverse and perhaps more liberating ways for students to think about their position within a field of urban practice that doesn't need to be restricted to sort of how architecture is defined professionally. So we'll stop here perhaps, and I think at this point it's more valuable for us to have an open conversation.
Thanks, Pat. It's about the lunch. It's Malcolm.